happy and honored today to be able to co-organize this session together with Green Africa Youth Organization and Environmental Defense Fund. We will have 2 dialogues on how to do more equitable science, especially about the impacts of SRM, and how to build an equitable movement around SRM.
Okay, welcome both. First, I have a question to you both. If you think about the conference so far, what kind of research efforts or perspectives are now needed the most, and how can these be? Does anyone feel like beginning?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think this conference has helped us to make a significant progress. Progress in terms of the meeting with the stakeholders or policymakers. It's helping knowledge dissemination, I put, among the policymakers, and also bringing the understanding of what we really want to do also to bear. What the impression I'm getting from the policymakers as a scientist is they're hungry to know what will really happen. So we need to speed up on research and get research findings that are concrete or discrete, as that now we, the scientists, are still blurred in terms of the results we are seeing, not so sure of the signal, which way it's going. And so the same feeling I think the policymakers are having, they want to start seeing discrete results, whether positive or negative. That's the feeling I'm getting
right.
here. Yeah.
They want to know.
They want to know, yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Liz?
Yeah, I would agree with that, that I think that's the question on everybody's mind, right, is exactly, and we can't probably know exactly what will happen under this. There's some uncertainty there, but getting a sense of which impacts are more known and at what level and what regions. I think there's actually a need as well for assessment of what we know. So kind of getting a baseline of how well we understand the impacts and where the uncertainty lies, and can that be resolved by research, or is there some level of uncertainty that can't be resolved, but there are other fruitful areas where we actually might want to go in greater detail. But I completely agree with you that it's a very it's on everyone's mind, especially decision makers. I heard it several times this conference. The need to know, the need to really understand what would happen if we were to implement this technology.
Right. Would you like to continue a little bit on the impacts of SRM, since you told me that EDF is looking into this, some impacts you would like to make known here?
Yes, and I just came from a great session before lunch that was going into a lot of the agricultural impacts on different kinds of agriculture. And I think one thing that was said in that session that I think is true is we don't know a lot about some of the very unique aspects of SRM. For example, light, the effect of light on plants and how that will affect crops if you have a different type of light, if you've cut the radiation by a little bit, if you've changed it more to diffuse radiation, what will that do to different kinds of crops, to ecosystems more generally? So I think there's some areas where our models that we typically use to project impacts are just not suited for the task right now, because they don't actually build in some of these pieces of the impact story that we need to know about. So, you know, our program, we're just getting started on our research program, so it's a fairly new program, the EDF program, but we're really trying to look at how we might harness data and empirical like analogs, like things like volcanoes or even wildfire smoke or different kinds of real-world phenomenon, and what those might then say about impacts and how those might then be used to maybe improve some of our impacts models. So trying to make that link and that connection in addition to understanding where the uncertainty is coming from. So, and some of the early impacts we think we want to study are obviously agriculture is like a huge one that people are already studying here, that we've seen lots of talks here at this forum, but we think there's more to be done. We've done a literature review as well at EDF of a systematic literature review of impacts across the board. And when you really try to look down to like the impacts that matter to people, like somebody talked about coffee and cocoa or like wheat or like different crops, there's just not as much research out there yet. And so, you know, we know a lot about global temperature, but nobody lives at global temperature. So we need to be thinking about and trying to research, you know, how these impacts that really matter at the personal scale, like food, water supply, health impacts, and so forth. That's the really place that we're really focusing on at EDF.
Right. I'll ask one more question
Sure.
of Lisa and then move on to Professor Nanama. Regarding the impact on vegetation from this reduced amount of UV light, but also this different nature of the light, it's more diffused. Do you think that there is a pretty straightforward way of getting answers to this, for example, through experimentation in greenhouses? And,
Well, that's a great question. And our inspiration for this topic came from a paper that looked at very large volcano eruptions, and they were actually able to tease out, this is a Proctor et al. Paper that some of you might have seen, they were able to tease out the effect of light during that, after that eruption on plants and look at the cooling effect of the aerosols, but also the light effect, and it was actually quite substantial. So that's like a way to use past data, you know, try to look at that question. But we also have discussed in sort of a workshop format of could you do shading experiments? You know, like could you put a certain kind of cloth, you know, up over, like we have some long-term sites in the United States, for example, but I think other countries also have these long-term observational sites. Could we install some shading cloth or some kind of different experimental setups that could look at the effect of a changed light environment on crops, for example, or on other kinds of ecosystems. So we are thinking about that, like and it wouldn't require, you know, aircraft or any kind of thing like that, but just trying to kind of mimic, you know, the light environment. And we don't know how well that will work. I mean, it's a science project, right? So it's an experiment.
Thank you. That's very interesting research. Professor Klutse, am I saying your last name right?
Klutse.
Klutse. Okay, thank you. You have been talking about the potential impacts of SRM on West Africa and Africa in general. Are there some dynamics that are underappreciated right now, do you think? In the West African climate systems, for example, that global models still struggle to capture? And I have another question regarding that. Are we similarly uncertain of regional future impacts of global warming without SRM, since we often use the same Earth system models to model that as well?
I think West Africa already has this complicated monsoon system that controls or modulates our rainfall and other parameters in the atmosphere. And so we already have, I would say, challenges with modeling in this space for rainfall especially. And rainfall is a very critical parameter for West Africa because we're overly dependent on rainfall agriculture that determines a lot for our economies and also food security. And so I'm bringing the modeling from the already challenged area, introducing the SRM. It's another challenge we're anticipating. So far, we have started, I would say, slowly, doing the modeling work of SRM and seeing the implication on rainfall and other parameters like humidity, which is equally very important for agriculture, and wind systems as well. So whatever results we have at the back of our mind the uncertainties that we already have with our modeling over the continent. Unfortunately, we've not had any groups or persons developing models from Africa or West Africa. The closest we have come is remodeling and readjusting models over the continent. And so we need to actually build models with Africa in perspective. Models that are built, this modeling is complicated, it's expensive, and so you go into developing a model with the most important parameters that you are interested in every region. So let's say a model developed in Europe we'll consider less of land use change, because land use doesn't change often, let's say in Europe. But in Africa, land use changes all the time, right, very constantly changing. And so if you develop a model like that and less interest of land use change, it means that you build already a lot of uncertainties if you run it in a place like West Africa. I'll use one example. Right. Building a model in Africa, for example, you would think not so much about ice and Arctics and glaciers. Yeah. But we also know that the melting of the ice affects a lot of our sea level rise and coastal erosion. But then it's not, I mean, when we have to build a model, we check out the very important things to consider first. That's just what we do in our modeling community. And so it's important that probably we develop a model in our region, of course, considering the global effect as well in our models. But for now, the only tool we have is what is developed elsewhere. That is what we try to mimic. We try to readjust to compare it with observation, and then we do projections from there. Yeah. So we have the baseline of our challenges with modeling, but this is also an area we need to know. So as Lisa said, this SRM research is important for Africa. For now, what we are looking at is the most important aspect of the impact we expect to have. Impact on temperature, we know, that's why we are doing SRM. But impact on rainfall, it's different for different areas in Africa for now. Impact on wind, impact of humidity is different from different areas. We are not so sure which side we are going for the continent. And our fear is that if we don't know too much and find ways of mitigating the impact, especially where it becomes negative on one side, we need to mitigate this impact or find ways of mitigating the negative impact of SRM. We'll run into conflict, run into so many governance issues, geopolitical issues. So for us, knowing is one thing, and then finding ways to deal with the negative impact is another thing if we have to do the deployment. Yeah. You
explain it well, but it sounds like a complicated topic.
Is, yeah.
Yeah.
It is, yeah. Yeah. So I can give an example here. So let's say that we have, so for Africa, let's say when we deploy SRM, we have good rainfall, good amount of rainfall, which is just enough for our agriculture in West Africa, but will cause less rainfall in, let's say, East Africa. Right. Could a solution like cloud seeding be enough to give like same amount of rain that is needed for their crop production that side? So these are some of the things like we need to understand. Yeah. We want to have a hope in the SRM, but as I said yesterday, we are not there yet. But if this will lead us into having some positivity for our climate in Africa, it's something we want to do. But then, as said here, we need to assess the risk and understand the impact. Yep.
It's interesting with the cloud seeding that you mentioned. It kind of sounds like there could be some like united efforts in Africa to make it as tolerable and good for everyone as possible. Maybe you can nudge it in the right direction a little bit. Moving on, Thelma Krug said at the plenary that SRM needs to be within a context or a framework. Now, in Operaatio Arktis, where I work, we have SRM existing within a tipping point governance framework, which is one place where it can fit in and perhaps be useful. What kind of framework or context would you put SRM in? Go ahead, Lisa.
So I guess from EDF and but also from having worked in climate so long, I think, and others have spoken about this. I mean, we always say mitigation is first. Like we have to do mitigation. That's even true if we were to do SRM, because you have to bring the carbon down, or, greenhouse gases down in the atmosphere. Otherwise, you're literally committed to an indefinite future of doing SRM as your greenhouse gases are rising. So,
Right.
you know, so I guess the context that we always think about is, you know, and I guess I should say also, we think of this as a research stage. We are not at all advocating for deployment. You know, this is understanding this more is what our organization's doing. So trying to look at this as something that, in the context, even if you were doing very well on mitigation, you know, and adaptation, and you know, carbon removal as that can come forward, you know, would you then need to use this in some way to cut down some of the very high temperatures?
Right.
But I think it's you know, certainly for us as a whole, it's very much a mitigation forward push for us still. Is, you know, we have a lot of different efforts on the mitigation front. So that's how we look at it. I think there was some discussion about substitutions over. We don't see SRM at all as a substitution for
Right.
mitigation. Yeah.
Could perhaps SRM be even thought as adaptation? Can you separate that far away from mitigation and CDR? You can continue here.
Yeah, even the IPCC's 7th assessment reports, the outline, it's considering SRM as an adaptation.
Really?
Options, because it's captured in working group 2, so it's assessed under adaptation. So there's assessment is on the risk that we could have if, so, I mean, cooling as an adaptation, for example. And in the working group 1, it's assessing SRM in terms of methodology and impacts. And so it's clear the direction or how you want, the perspective you want to put this, more like cooling the earth. Yeah. And bringing in the issue of tipping point, we are in a trajectory that is really warming the earth, and the difficult discussion of cutting greenhouse gases with some efforts being made, but still we see the greenhouse gases rising and unprecedentedly rising.
Yeah.
As Lisa said, SRM is not an alternative, it's another pathway altogether for the cooling. So the effort of mitigation must continue. As a matter of fact, we should be more serious with cutting down of our emission. Where we stand to gain is another pathway for cooling. That is not to say we should reduce the effort of mitigation, but that has been the fear around the world, especially from the developing countryside, that when we advance in SRM research and we see the positivity of its maybe positive part of cooling, it may replace the mitigation efforts and probably cut funds for adaptation and mitigation to developing countries. But it's a legitimate fear.
Yeah.
But that also doesn't mean that if there's a technology to help cool the earth, we should not exploit.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's a challenge to think of as an adaptation, because so far adaptation has been thought as such a local activity, because it's so specific to the place and to the baseline that you're starting from, and so on. So I think that would be a challenge to, I mean, certainly at a global level, it could be thought global cooling, but I think when you get down to it, it's how is it going to affect each place, and you know, will it provide help in adapting, or will it produce a third? It is actually a novel climate to think about a greenhouse gas warmed climate plus SRM. It's sort of a third state of climate. It doesn't bring us back to a pre-industrial climate. It's a different kind of climate.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a challenge for thinking about it as adaptation. I think it could be more types of aspects to try to adapt to. So anyway, I can see, I think it's good it's covered in Working Group 2, because we have to be assessing this more. So the more places we can assess this technology, the better. I think we just have a challenge about thinking about it, about the action on adaptation. How would that actually end up playing out?
Yeah, it might not help everyone adapt.
Yeah, or it might be just hard to predict. If you're planning for a certain kind of climate in your adaptation strategy, and then you have a different climate that's maybe it's cooler, but it's also got some other aspects to rainfall or things like
Yeah.
that. It might be different.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that it's just a challenge for it.
I understand. Yeah. Well, to the next question, how can we ensure research findings are communicated effectively to policymakers and the public? And how do we responsibly navigate situations where decision makers need to protect citizens from climate risks, but the underlying science and ethics are still full of unknowns, as in the case of SRM?
Yeah, I think this is this difficulty we all find ourselves in, just from policy engagement with ministers and advisors to presidents. And the question is, should they use this limited funds they usually will use for fighting poverty, providing quality water resources for the people, seeing to the education of the ordinary people, to fund the SRM? Because this is new, and there's not been plan in the past on looking at how to fund the SRM. So that's a big question, and this is an elephant room. In Ghana, we normally say that's the elephant in the room. How do we fund SRM research? So from the developing country side, I'm not sure any government is ready to go that route of using some kind of funds which is probably planned for either adaptation or seeing to the welfare of its people to fund SRM. But this is also an important area to research in. And so we need to find a way to deal with it. I don't have the answer here now, but then we know sources, some other sources we could use, I don't know. But definitely the feeling I get from developing country government is not like simply going to use some funds already available that is already limited to fund the SRM.
So the Degrees Initiative is pretty important.
It has been very helpful to, the Degrees Initiative has been very helpful. Even the knowledge growing in the Global South, it's great with degrees funding, and I think that's very appreciative as well,
So I would say on the communication question about communicating to decision makers, I think this is a particularly technical topic. I mean, all of climate change sometimes is, but this is very technical. Like, you try to read the papers, it's full of acronyms, it's full of scenarios, RCP 8.5, RCP this, like sulfur 6. I mean, like, no one speaks like that in the real world, like only in the world of science. So I think it boils down, like, I mean, the engagements I've had with decision makers, it's trying to be as simple while being still accurate of what we're talking about, and being also pretty short in the presentation you make, and then allowing a lot of time for questions, because I think that it's in the questions that it actually comes out what people's misconceptions are or what they want to know more about. And allowing time, if you have a short briefing with a decision maker, try to make sure you're letting them ask questions and letting them lead the way on what they want to know. And I just say get rid of jargon as much as you can. I mean, if you cannot explain this to your grandmother in a normal way, like I have this experience in my grad school, like, I was like doing my PhD and I gave my practice talk, and my great aunt was like, why is anyone studying this? What's this about? Like, it was just so like, aha moment. That is how we need to think about it. We have a sense of respect for the person we are talking with, and a sense that we need to basically understand their questions, and they are curious, they want to know, and we need to be thinking about, it's not about impressing them with the great research we've done, it's about understanding, they're trying to understand this because they have a role, like, of trying to make a decision about this in the future. Anyway, so allowing lots of time for their questions, and being able to explain this in a way that does not rely on your jargon of whatever field you're in, I think is really important.
Right.
Let me just add that the same thing was what I was trying to remember or think through. When we started the SRM research in a room, we were thinking of how do we communicate this to the ordinary people? Like, what are you doing, really? Okay, so we're going to block a small part of the sun because the sun gives us heat as well. And so we block a small part of the sun to reduce the heat from the sun. I'm like, how do you communicate this to the ordinary people? Yeah. So a typical politician wants to be in power all the time. And so how to communicate this, really, especially if you're going to use public funds to support SRM research, that communication part is very important. And you don't want to communicate in such a way that your opponent or your opposition will use it against you. So that communication bit is very important. Yeah.
Okay, I really like this. It's a great insight to just talk about this to family and grandmother, not only to spread awareness, but also to learn how to communicate to people who are not in this bubble, you could say. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Viktor, and to our amazing speakers for really setting the stage for our next dialogue on building an equitable movement. I'd like to welcome back onto the stage Ellen Haaslahti, hope I didn't butcher that, who is the head of communications and co-founder of Operaatio Arktis, who you have seen earlier. Yeah. And Ernest Ofori, who's the head of the mitigation program at Green Africa Youth Organization. Thank you so much for joining us on stage. I just want to note as well that we will have time for questions at the end for all of our panelists across both dialogues. Our representatives of Operaatio Arktis and Green Africa Youth Organization today will discuss the need for and lessons learned in developing a regionally diverse and youth-driven movement to advance dialogue on SRM research. We know that young people have found it extremely difficult to get involved in different policymaking, research, and governance spaces. Yep. But we need to be at the table. The amazing work being done by Operaatio Arktis and GAYO is really a testament to the fact that young people are no longer creating spaces or dialogues on the side for our own engagement and inclusion, but we are leading movements and spaces on the front lines and in our own right. On that note, Ernest, the first question to you, what role do you believe youth can play in advancing equitable dialogue on SRM research?
Thank you very much, Taylen. I think this is very important that we understand how powerful the youth has become today, currently. I mean, if you're looking at the most vibrant demographic is the youth, and it's not different from the continent, currently Africa. We have the biggest growing youth population, and for a very long time, we have seen the voices of African youth being heard. Surprisingly, now you can find in every regional gathering a young person in there who is challenging the status quo, who is speaking fact and communicating truth and perspective of young people in these gatherings. And this is the reason why this happened more often was because anytime the youth were given opportunities, when we felt they cannot be equals in terms of reasoning and reasoning capacity or technical capacities or experiences, comparing the age difference or the age gap. So mostly we were sidelined. But now if you could see, majority of the young people are building their capacities. Young people are doing PhDs. Young people on the continent are studying. They are finding themselves, useful and really making input in policy dialogues and what's not on the continent. One, I feel that the question of equity and intergenerational equity could really be checked by young people. Why? Because if you look at the generation now, who are doing amazing, this generation might not be super active in the next 20, 40 years. And their actions today, their inactions today, are going to determine the weight of the impact of the people, which is mostly going to be felt by young people in the next 3 or 4 generations. So I think if we have young people who understand these conversations, who can really sit with global leaders or policymakers and let them know that, hey, this decision you are taking or this attitude of not caring about conversations like SRM has the tendency of being implemented whether or not you understand. So when global conversations like this is happening, it's not about how much you are capacitated on this subject or how much you do not know. When conversations are happening, we all know the global north make a lot of decisions, whether or not you want to side with them. It would be a great disservice to the youth and the generation on this continent to find our leaders or our policymakers not understanding the subject, hence not making any decision at all. I think we should have a demographic that would understand the subject, push the generation that is currently making decisions to understand also, and air their view, whether or not their views will be taken into consideration. I think they have represented us for good. So this is the reason why young people play a key role in this conversation, and I feel spaces like this really ensure that that equity is there. We have young people on this panel, which really shouldn't have been the case, for us to talk about our perspective and what we think needs to be done. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernest. And you've touched as well on the resilience of young people and our attempts to really shift the narrative and the status quo in getting involved in these spaces, regardless of the key challenges that we face. And to that, Ellen, what are some of these key challenges in building a regionally diverse movement around SRM research, and how can they be addressed?
So, thank you. I really agree with everything that Ernest has powerfully said. I think the challenges are very different in different cultures, although they have some similarities for sure. Like Ernest said, is even in Finland, I think it's it's largely on youth, on themselves to go and find out about SRM. Like nobody's gonna come to you and explain what it is, although now there's Operaatio Arktis and hopefully it's easier, so that's our job. But even then, for us, it's a big challenge to get the information through to different people within this current context of global events and a lot of information around. And another challenge is that people might not have the time, the capacity, the interest to engage. For example, in the environmental movement, people are super occupied with everything that's already going on in a way, and adding SRM to that might be difficult. And I think something that we have learned is that it might be more effective to have like bilateral meetings with different groups and like have enough time. Like Lisa said, with policymakers, it's the same with youth groups and environmental movements, to really sit down and have enough time to engage, rather than, for example, going into conferences and have side events and try to invite new people there and try to have a panel and so on. Although here it's a very different setting, but when you think about engaging with young people, you also need to have very direct encounters with those groups. And I think it's very important also to engage across different borders of the society. You have to really go out there and find different peoples and do the effort yourselves to introduce this topic to different people. And for us in Operaatio Arktis, although we've been successful in many things, I think we still have a lot to do with the environmental movement in Finland to do better reaching out to their direction. because it's such a hard topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen. And you touched a little bit on that representation and engagement, how important it is within communities. And Ernest, how can we ensure, based on the work that you're doing with GAYO, that voices from the Global South, from Africa, and other underrepresented regions are included in SRM discourse globally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the right thing to be done first, that all the communities, including the vulnerable communities, the indigenous people from all across the globe, people who are mostly affected, should be in the center of the conversation. They should not just be in the conversation, they should be part of the decision making. Why? They are really experiencing the brunt of climate change. They are experiencing the impact the most. And I'm talking about proportionally, if you are looking not just the Global South, right? I honestly didn't know until we met Operaatio Arktis that the impact of climate change is greatly felt in the Arctic too. We are in Africa and we're feeling that, climate change is very impacting us seriously and we are losing a lot of properties and whatnot in Africa, and not thinking that the same situation is being replicated there, but the impacts are different. So I think we should have fair representations. The video that was played before the session had few people from different places talking. I think that's what fair representation means. What Degrees is doing with the Global Forum is what fair representation means. We should have people coming from different places, and mostly people who are really affected by climate change, making sure they understand. So I'll just put it in one compound sentence as equity and inclusion again. Now, equity is when these people are brought, everybody who matters, who is impacted, are brought onto the table to air their view on this, whether they support, whether they do not support. Their views are very important. As the scientist has their own views, the ordinary people should have their views. And nobody's commentaries should be shouted. Everybody needs to be listening. To inclusion. I said here yesterday that inclusion, to me, is not inclusion if the people included are not capacitated to understand the subject being debated. So we should make sure that the people that we are bringing into the conversation as a way of inclusion are capacitated to understand the subject, to make sure all their inputs are well noted. For example, if you're looking at capacities in terms of research, the Global North is far above the Global South. Nanama and Co were talking about how we do not even have models dedicated in Africa that could help us check the various parameters for our various modeling. I think if we have those research resources, or those resources could also help us make decisions based on our own modeling and our own understanding, and really have a standpoint to this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Ernest. And you touched a little bit as well about the unawareness from Africa, especially on the impacts of climate change as well in vulnerable and underrepresented regions in the global north. Of course, our perspectives in Africa are shaped by so much of trauma when it comes to colonial legacies that's still felt on the continent. Mm. When it comes to SRM, how can we build trust? This is a question for both of you. How can we build trust between environmental movements and organizations in the global south and global north? And are the challenges that we're facing similar or different? And why is it so important for us to have this dialogue?
I don't know if you know that.
Well, if I start, I'm just going to echo what you said about your own experience of us meeting and then exchanging thoughts and learning a lot about it. I think it would be super important for us to collaborate more and provide that possibility also for a broader set of groups for them to meet. So it's essential that people can exchange their experiences, and so that way we can find like shared motivations and interests, for example, thinking about SRM research and priorities there and so on. So I think that's super important, and we are very happy in Operaatio Arktis to do that work with you, and hopefully we will be able this year to put together this kind of event where we go deep into the Arctic Africa perspectives together. And what I think is really important, thinking of like building trust between vulnerable communities and between Global North and Global South in the context of SRM research, is it's very important to be very open and reflective and really go to the encounterings with empathy, so that people can relate to you and they can understand what's your motivation to work with this topic, and that way it might be a lower threshold for engaging in a very genuine way, I believe. And yeah, I think in Operaatio Arktis, what's really important in our work as well is that we should always promote like climate justice overall at the same time as we talk about SRM. So for example, thinking about how can we help scientists to make the research ethics more tangible, more concrete. For example, when it comes to intergenerational justice or indigenous people's rights, thinking about, for example, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. So it's something that we really want to work with, thinking about how to apply that in practice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen. And it's so important that when doing this work, we're really taking into account the principles of justice, being grounded into it, and also being really aware of the empathy and transparency that's needed during these engagements. And Ernest, what are your thoughts on why these dialogues are so important between Global North and Global South collaboration?
Yeah, I think there is a big gap, sort of a gap, not necessarily big. We do not understand the dynamics of the various climatological patterns and how climate affects either regions. Mostly we tend to be biased because most of the research says Africa is mostly impacted, or a certain Asia is mostly impacted and what's not. But I think finding some of these living experiences and sharing them in a platform like this is very essential. Like Ellen said, until we met them, we didn't know how bad it is in the Arctic. And we already knew what is happening in the Sahel and in the Saharan. It's really bad. But I think having a gathering like this, sharing experiences, would also really stem a lot of conversation and debate, and will really shape most of the solution or ideas that we want to bring on board to help these ideas come into shape. And the element of climate justice is very important. I think that we should not undermine the people who are mostly affected and their voices being heard regardless, something that I already said, and reiterating it's very important. And I also feel that majority of our researchers are also not really united to some extent, because if you look at research, to some extent, a lot of the research are Global North based. You find folks from the Global South being sort of given an opportunity to research with a Global North institution, which is not African-led or Global South-led. So we can say that, oh, there are 3 people or 4 people from the Global South in this team, but you clearly know that they do not run anything. The expertise are just needed, and they are. But can we have a research which is led by Africans, research which is funded by the continent, where we can make solid and substantial decisions for ourselves? But I think overall, it's very essential that we really underscore the importance of cross-collaboration research, even from one discipline to the other, like social, physical science, interdisciplinary research, so that it would not just be tilted towards the science and what SRM would do to the various climate patterns, but what it would do onto humanity, onto food and food system, water, and all the other variables. Very important.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ernest. And yeah, it's so important that, from an African perspective, that this research is African-led and African-owned. And those engagements within communities are still happening, supplementing that research. We can't be objective about just the research findings. We have to take into account the lived realities of people on the ground. Thank you so much. And just for the interest of time, I think we are going to move to our Q&A session. But do we have any final words from the two of you?
No, I'm very happy for a gathering like this, really finding young people, giving the opportunity to really speak about perspectives and what we think about SRM from our own various activities and what we've been doing. And I'm super grateful for such opportunity.
Yeah, likewise. And I think we have a lot of work to do together also to find out more about, from a broader groups of youth, about their perspectives. And hopefully, if that's work that you're interested in, feel free to come and talk to us about what we're planning.
Yeah.
Cool.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elena. Thank you so much, both of you. And I will hand it back to Viktor to moderate the Q&A session.
Right. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Can we get mics? Taylen can get them. Yeah.
1 second. We'll get the mic.
You get time to think. Great. It works, I think.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everybody. It has been a very good session, and it gives me hope. There was a time I was complaining to my daughter that, hey, I don't know what is happening to the youths. And actually, that was what my father also said to me. Also, he was worried about me. Now, I was worried. Then my daughter said, don't worry about us. We are going to sort ourselves out. I said, why? He said, because we do understand each other, but your generation keep on pointing fingers. So she said, I shouldn't worry. And I seem to be believing it now. Because if in the session that we have listened, that we have heard, you see collaboration among the youths. You see cross-university cooperation. Somebody in Nigeria collaborating with somebody in Ghana, somebody in Japan, all those things among the youths. So it gives me personally, it gives me hope that things are going to happen. Look at the three of them from different countries, and they have been talking with each other. So I'm just trying to say that we don't have problem, that you will sort all the mess that my generation had created. So I just want to end with that positive note. Then regarding funding and regarding what you said about taking our the global south to the north to do research. And you see, we call it university because knowledge is universal. You can be trained in Finland and you come back to add value in your country because Finland has got all the equipment. So it is left to you now when you get back to your country to innovate. So if we have to wait for the government of Africa, the African Union, to fund and to initiate what you're saying, we'll be waiting forever. I think we should learn from each other. We also have people from the global north also come to the south also to be students, you see? So it's two-way. I wouldn't want us to be that very sensitive. There is hope, and I'm very happy that there is hope among the youths. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Any replies?
Sure. We can take maybe
Go ahead.
maybe several comments.
Yeah, go
from
ahead.
the-
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for this panel. This morning we heard on the stage, the suggestion that the priority is not a temporal priority, like even if mitigation should be first and SRM should not be the most important, that perhaps it should start now or very soon. And I just wonder, I would like to hear what you think of that suggestion, especially thinking about an equity and justice perspective.
I could start, but I would like to hear from the younger colleagues here. I think that there is a tension in the timescale idea, and I think on the one hand you could say, well, obviously the first priority is mitigation. We've all been saying that SRM, if it were ever deployed, would be sort of a kind of a last resort type of idea. On the other hand, there are certain, as somebody mentioned, tipping points as a framing device. Like, some people are worried about particular tipping points, and so if you need infrastructure in place to think about deploying, or large-scale experiments that are out of the realm of most of anything that's conceived of right now, when are those going to happen? And it feels to me like knowledge, if we want that knowledge in place where somebody might decide to go quickly, that's why it's urgent to basically do the research now. It could be also urgent to think about the timing, just because of the time it takes to build up infrastructure and agreement, governance about how to do this and who gets to decide. All of that is going to take many, many, many years, I feel like. So I think that's where the comment this morning about timescales comes from, is that it takes quite a long time to build agreement, to come up with this understanding of what actually the world might want to do in the future, and like how to actually do it. That takes quite a long time to come to agreement, even if we're not sure. But I'd love to hear other perspectives.
Maybe I add a bit to it. I'm sorry I missed your session. I was called into another small meeting. So the difficulty in discussing equity at this point, because if you come to the developing world, we doing our best in cooling the earth by leaving our trees on and planting more trees, because we have like land spaces to plant more trees, and this is not the same story we have in the developed world. And so should we say the developed world should pay for research? Because in as much as we know these greenhouse gases that have implication on the global warming, it's more happening from the global north perspective than the global south perspective. But we are also having this effort of cooling the earth from the global south and removing greenhouse gases from trees and photosynthesis process and all of that. So if you really want us to talk frankly, this is the approach we can go in terms of equity for the effort that is going on in the developing countries. So that is not to say the developed countries not making effort. With all the effort happening, we can't see the greenhouse gases go down, it's still going up and increasing the warming in the atmosphere. So we need to talk frankly about this equity and the question of who should fund the research and who should own the research and all of that in there. But with all of these, I think there should be a movement of developing a framework around SRM. Even if it is research and deployment, we need to have a framework, a global framework to guide what we do and how we do things. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I just want to add that it's a super interesting question also from the point of view of intergenerational justice and kind of like the precautionary approach, like how do you interpret that in one sense. If maybe our perspective to that in Operaatio Arktis would be that it would be better in terms of intergenerational justice to produce information now for the younger generations and rather with them, so that we can be prepared and we will have the capacity to engage in making decisions about it. And in there we need urgent action, I think.
Well, my question is perhaps at the limit of the session, but we were talking about environmentalism here and SRM. I'm just quoting a press notice that appeared by ETC Group, an American-based NGO, last week, and my question is about the dynamics in the civil society and in your countries. the press releases announced Africa is not a laboratory. Civil society denounces Degrees Global Forum. Solar geoengineering is a dangerous neo-colonial threat. African civil society organizations are outraged by the Degrees Global Forum being hosted in South Africa next week, calling it an act of climate colonialism, effort to co-opt the African climate movement, academics and youth that will threaten the sovereignty, ecosystems and futures of African peoples. That is quite an important statement, or quite a strong statement, and there were other publications from around that part of civil society in the past, which were for me, as European policymaker, shocking. So what is the dynamics in youth among indigenous groups? It seems like, I was told, there are 1,500 civil society organizations in Europe, in North America, standing like a wall against SRM.
Yeah.
So how do we, I know some of these people, how shall we deal with that?
Yeah, I really want to take that. So this article came out last week when the African group were having our small meetings and our planning before this the Global Forum started. So the African group, we put up a response, more like a counter press to this, like, Africa is not a laboratory for SRM deployment and all of that. So we try to explain. So these are all bordered around communication, and we've been talking about communication all this while. It's about communication. It's about understanding what it is. So their point is that don't do it. What does it mean, don't do it? So we try to explain. And our way around this is to have meeting like small groups, like what we are doing here. Before this session, I was in a meeting with the African policymakers and researchers together in one small room where we discussed what it is, what we have to do, what are the questions coming from the policymakers and needs to, or what they expect us to do as researchers, because we know that we also don't know much, but then at this point we still must communicate or start some communication before what we do is miscommunicated, like these CSOs. So these CSOs, or let's say oppositions, have been there since in virtually everything that is new and everything that starts. We experienced that when climate change started becoming an issue. They came up again when we were discussing adaptation issues. They will keep coming, but then we also have to stand strong. So if they are a wall, we should also find a way to break that wall and then explain as much as possible, explain or communicate this information, why we need to do SRM research, why we need to do SRM research. So for me, it's about communication and communicating it right and to the right people. We should start it right with the policymakers, because if their target is the general public and the policymakers, we can also target the policymakers first, and then it will spread to the general public as much as possible.
Yeah, I think I want to add up to that. I think it's also very legitimate for any opposing group to air their view. It's really set the stage for a very good debate, a very sound debate. It would be strange if there is a conversation of SRM happening and you don't find anyone opposing. I think that would be super strange. So it's very good. Majority of the youth groups in there, environmental justice folks, they are saying the right thing, but I think the conversation boils down to communication. A lot of them do not want to have the conversation at all. They do not want to understand. They don't want to hear about it. But the problem here is them imposing on others what they think it is. And to me, that is where I think we should be doing better, particularly the scientists on the continent and across. You understand this better. Technically, this was proposed from you. So we should find better ways of communicating it so that people get to understand and make decisions for themselves based on their understanding. It's so wrong for you to tell me you do not want me to eat a particular food. And the reason is because it is not good. Why not tell me why it is not good so that I determine whether to eat or not to eat? And that's the situation that's happening here. So I support Prof on that as an issue of communication, and it's okay that's happening.
I would really echo with this. I think we're out of time, but maybe...
No, well said, I think.
Yes.
Lisa Dilling still had some ending words, I think.
Yeah, we were hoping that you would maybe
Oh my
wrap
goodness.
up.
I just feel like I'll just say I just learned so much from being a part of the preparation and also the execution of this panel and from the questions and from this conference in general. And I think it does give, somebody mentioned hope. I can't remember which speaker. It just does give me a lot of hope. I think that I want to say something about the generational thing. I think sometimes people in my generation say, oh, we're so happy there's the youth. They're going to solve the problem. But I mean, we all have to solve the problem. We still have plenty of time on this earth to be solving it as older people too. So I really am encouraged by the cooperation and the dialogue. I love what I think it was Ernest, what you said about you know, Africa-led, research led by Africans, and a professor at the end of the row here is doing that, and it's amazing. And so this is I think, a really growing and exciting community here that is challenging topic, very challenging topic, but all of these issues of justice and participation and intergenerational equity, they play out in multiple dimensions in all of the things we talk about in climate change. It's playing out in this as well. So we kind of can carry forward learning from other dimensions of climate into this situation right now. And I think find that there's ways through this in the future. So thanks for letting me participate.
Thank you. I think it's a good ending.
One more question is coming in.
Oh, we promised one more. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, it's working, okay. So I think in my personal experience, like I used to suffer from climate anxiety maybe 7 to 8 years ago. And back then I was at Harvard, heading a lab, having the privilege to think about the future. And I come from a different field, low temperature physics, material science. And when I first learned about the urgency, I started just Google, like graphs. You see the first 100 graphs that pops up have on the x-axis time, well into the future, end of the century. I think it's a privilege for us, the 1%ers, to be able to have the capacity to think about the future. And it's only when you think about the future and what happens to your kids, yourself, your grandchildren, your legacy of research, that you start to have this kind of anxiety. But as I have lived in Africa for the past 3 years, I realize how ridiculous that is. People are struggling to survive on an hour-to-hour, day-to-day basis. Our trainees, they survive on $1 per day, $2 per day. We do our best as a small donor, individual donor-funded organization to provide them with food and transportation money to the best of our capabilities. So I'm wondering, when we're discussing like the future several centuries from now, the trajectories of SAI, how do we weigh the real importance of our considerations against the experience of sentient beings on this planet at this moment? If we had a global calculus of the needs, wish, and wants of the people, those of us having the privilege to worry about the future through SAI or solar radiation management, is that really truly a legitimate concern? Or is it adaptation, the more humanistic and ethical perspective? So that's a question I think we need to consider. How do we include those experiences, those lived experiences, into the conversation and into the mind of SAI researchers? And how does that inform what kind of strategies we take in our research?
Right.
And a second point that's more immediately implementable, I think, is there's a huge array of direct cooling methods worked on by organizations such as Healthy Climate Action Coalition. There's a dozen different ways to cool the planet in addition to
Thank you,
SAI.
Jay. I think we might take an answer at this point
So
if we have one.
It would be a suggestion. Sometimes you leave empty chairs. Maybe just invite some HPAC folks to also participate and include other voices that's not being platformed.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, the HPAC people are people I've been communicating with a bit, and I think that their situational awareness is at a higher level than the average here at this conference, I'd say. Also, regarding thinking about the future, it's a great privilege. I feel like I have a little bit of a similar origin story, only with the difference that I dropped out of university to be able to use more of my time just thinking about the future and the things that I find relevant. And yeah, relating to how someone can feel great anxiety even though they live in the global north and are not in any like danger themselves right now. Maybe that's just empathy towards sentient beings already suffering, not just humans, but animals as well, and thinking about life in the future as well on this planet. You don't only exist in this time in that sense when you think about the future a lot.
Yeah, I'll just add that I don't think it's an either or, adaptation and SRM or adaptation and mitigation. I mean, we need all of the above, has to be all of the above, and of course thinking about the day-to-day experience in poverty. They're just, the good thing about like, there are lots of different people tackling parts of this problem, and so I think we have to keep that in mind. And this community is a pretty small community still, even though it's a growing community, it's pretty small. I was here in Cape Town actually in 2018 and there was an adaptation conference. It was much bigger, you know, like there's a lot of researchers on adaptation, and so I can see this being, I guess in my mind, I don't think of this as either or, like you can't do this because we need to be concerned about this. I think it's more different people in different lanes and different skill sets working on the problem, hopefully with the good of the world in mind and the good of people. I think that's what we're trying to say in this session is we need to be working on equity and talking with people, thinking about future generations. And we know it's certainly a luxury to be at this conference, but it's something that we hope we're trying to do some good in the world. So that's how I would think of it.
Thank you. That's time. So a round of applause.
Thanks.